There we go. Well, good morning. I am with Kristina Dryza, and it is such a pleasure to be with you this morning. And I'm so grateful that we have an opportunity to share some time with you. So just a quick little bio about Kristina, and she's had a very active career as an archetypal consultant, which is how I first discovered you, as well as author and speaker and dancer and futurist. And probably the list could go on. And I know that your writing includes contributions to CNN Travel and the David Report and Canvas 8 and the Joseph Campbell Foundation. And I'm sure that that list is actually quite endless on your website, as I've noticed. But one of the things that I think you really bring to our conversation has to do with the fact of your experiencing extensive travel and lived in different countries. So you bring a very world vast approach to our discussion this morning. And we're talking about archetypes in particular. And I am really looking forward to diving into our discussion.
Me too. Me too.
Is there something that you would like to add about your brief introduction there that we should know?
Yeah, I think that was absolutely perfect. And I hope that it's more, I guess, through our conversation, there'll be an unraveling or an unfolding of these ideas. And then, yes, also how they exist in the commercial world.
I'm sure that will happen. And one of the things that I noticed on your website was this great quote. And you say that you live and breathe the archetypal realm. So how does that unfold for you, and what does that mean? What can we understand about that from your comprehension?
Well, I guess it can also be very simple and just in how we have conversations with friends. So, you know, a friend was having, you know, troubles with a bully at work. And because we know the archetypal realm, we know that that person is not bullying my friend. They have the pattern of the bully. And so basically they would bully anyone that was actually in their realm or kind of next to them. And so I think by knowing archetypes and their universality and also their impersonality, it almost gives us some distance. And I think from that witness and that observer consciousness, we can see what are some of these archetypal dynamics that are in play in the world or in ourselves or in our family. And it's a bit like, you know, it's either that saying like, do the pattern or the pattern does you. For those that are familiar with astrology, do Mars or Mars will do you. And I think within this, just this self-awareness just allows us to say, will I be at the mercy of the pattern? Or can I actually use the pattern in a really constructive way to create something new in the situation?
And that's one of the things that I think I'm just beginning to get a hold on, and that is this whole idea of patterns, and that, you know, the world operates on patterns, and nature operates on patterns, and people being nature, they're operating on patterns too. And I think that you really live and breathe that kind of in alignment with what your quote says. So how did you come to recognize the significance and pervasiveness of patterns?
Yeah, or just before that, I would just say, like, we're patterned beings in a patterned universe. And so my first book was on tidal, lunar, seasonal, and circadian patterns, because I could see the influence that they were having on the field that I was working on, which is innovation, creativity, and leadership. But myself, and I think all of us have this, we have some rogue patterns within us. And what I really found really helpful through Carol and Mace's work, and obviously Carl Jung, is almost the sense that rather than saying I am a saboteur, making it my identity, it was easier if I said, like, oh, the pattern of sabotage is active or alive in me. So a pattern, it can either be animated or de-animated. And I just found myself that when I conflated myself and my identity with the pattern, I never had any power. And so by then to be able to, again, to externalize it, to view it as a pattern, and to recognize that, yes, I as you said earlier, I was a futurist. I'm very fortunate I got known as one of the best in the world, but it wasn't because I was a good futurist. It was in a way because I knew how to read patterns. The patterns tell me the future. So if we look at someone that has the pattern of addiction, we know through that pattern that they are going to put the substance above everything else, their job, their family. So the pattern will tell us where that road of addiction will take them. So I think it was through obviously through, in a way, my own neuroses, looking at patterns, but just the sense also more of how cosmos and psyche are interlinked. So some of those greater patterns that kind of exist, as well as some of those, the macro ones, as well as micro ones. And I think that through the patterns, what I could almost feel or kind of touch into was how the mythic and the mundane were kind of weaving themselves together. And I think one of the first things to bring about change, obviously, is awareness, but we really do need to recognize what is the narrative that I'm telling to myself about myself before we can say, how do we then co-create a new narrative, what it means to be a human being in this day and age where we're all going to become galactic beings. Through working with my clients and their archetypal patterns, which is, yes, we do need awareness, but often we have to hold that awareness for a while. I think we're in this myth of instant quick fix, Amazon Prime download speed transformation, where it's like I get the insight and then the next moment I'm transformed. So it's like I go to bed a flawed human being and in the morning wake up a divine spark. No, sometimes we have to carry that awareness for a while before we can actually move it into conscious choice. And I'm sure the people listening, they'll know with some things that they could move the awareness to conscious choice, maybe within a month or two, and others still a couple of years. They're still spiraling around the issue because maybe it's still only a cognitive understanding. It's why so many of my clients say, why do I know better, but I have the inability to do better? And that's because you actually haven't almost in a way met the pattern on a cellular and a bodily and a somatic kind of level. So there's many layers through which we work with patterns, whether it is actually more in, the abstract kind of realm or very tangibly through the body.
And that reminds me of your book, where Grace and the wind connect, and she really learns the patterns of energy from the wisdom of the wind. So I think that does that book kind of embody what you were just referring to?
Yeah, or very much the sense that, we can't break the laws of nature, but only ourselves against them. So these rhythms and kind of these patterns that exist. And sometimes, it's not that nature is the it's the us. And if we look at the way that we objectify nature at the moment, say with social media, like people will actually say, oh, I've got to put some filter on, there wasn't enough peach or enough violet or something like that, or I've got to go out on the weekend to be in nature. And it's like, well, what are you standing on now? And I think it's just that sense to be able to recognize one's own nature. And I think we know that archetypally it's those patterns that are in our blood. It's what we cannot not do. You could go to somebody's house that doesn't have the host archetype, and maybe you'll be lucky if you get a glass of water. And there's others that have the host archetype, and there'll always be a banquet or a spread because they cannot not do it because it is in the blood. And so I think the more and more that we return to these patterns that are very, in a way, instinctive and natural to us, as much as, say, is there an archetype of destiny, a pattern that maybe because of a circumstance I have to develop. Maybe a single mom going through a divorce has to really develop that archetype of the warrior that might not have actually been in her natal soul contract, but is obviously a very kairos moment of the time, a pattern that requires forging within her.
I love your references to the various archetypes, and I'm so aware that while we're speaking, we're mourning the loss of Queen Elizabeth, and I'm sure that whole archetype of queen is kind of going through some changes as we speak. Is there anything you could just add to the queen archetype as you see what we're going through at this time?
Well, I mean, it's definitely a huge archetypal shift on the chessboard of life. We will never in our lifetime see a queen like that ever, ever, ever again. And I think it was almost the sense that such benevolent rulership. And yes, of course, there'll be claims of colonialism and the role of the British Empire. But actually, if we look at someone as in that personage of what does it mean to be a queen, and so often I think that we have this idea that it's only the queen bee, the one, but actually a true queen knows almost the light within herself, that she invites that light out actually in others. That's what that grace actually is. And I think for many of us, the nobility and the dedication and the service, it's almost like some of us, we wake up on the wrong side of the bed and like the day's over, but to be able to kind of see someone with just that, beyond the stamina and the discipline, but it was almost this magnanimous light that kind of went out as being almost a force for good, in the sense of what does that mean in our own lives, to be able to say, how do I bring a sense of nobility to the situation? What's the majesty here when, I don't know, two sides are kind of really arguing there? And almost in a sense, what then is the divine in the situation wanting to draw our attention to? So I think, yes, that definitely in a way, because we don't really see the Empress anymore, of course, now the Queen. I think obviously when Princess Diana died, that also shifted the princess archetype. And so now I think it's more being able to evaluate if the aristocracy, if those archetypes that belong to that family are relevant for the zeitgeist that we live in now, where it's much more associated with, say, blood and nepotism, than now what we want in a more equitable society, which is much more around meritocracy. So it will be very interesting to see the democratization of what once was almost a very elite institution.
So if we bring it from a global level and shift it down to the personal level, I also am taken with your statement that it takes energy, space, and stamina, and the courage of the soul to enter and explore what's uncertain and uncharted and unrevealed. How do you suggest people go about taking a look at what their own patterns and archetypal influences might be?
Yeah, I mean, like Carl Jung had that quote, you can either be good or whole, but not both. And so archetypes, other than being universal and impersonal, they have both a light and a shadow, or we could say a grace and a challenge to the pattern, or there's an empowering and a disempowering aspect. So if we only want to see ourselves in the light, which is really what Instagram and Facebook are, our highlight reel of all our successes, it's not really the truth of the situation. And so archetypes within themselves, they contain a mythology, they contain a vocabulary, they contain a dress, they contain everything. And within that, they also contain that shadow side. But if you can't say you're a kind person without first being able to recognize that I have the capacity to be cruel. And by not exercising my cruelty, then I can make the claim I am a kind person. I'm going to say we're kind. So to be able to look at some of these shadow patterns that exist within us, especially within the survival archetypes that Carolyn Mace would talk about, which is, the child and the victim and the saboteur and the prostitute, not the person on the street corner, but how we sell ourselves for safety and security and survival in the physical world. To look at some of those shadow elements, that's, I think, a courage to be able to say, it's also part of me, but it's not the whole of me. And again, what we're wanting to do is take some of the shadow from behind, so it's not driving us unconsciously, to just have it out of the corner of our eye so we can have a conscious relationship with it. So it really is that courage to recognize the commonality, as I said, the universality of these patterns. We all have them. But again, not to be driven by the shadow or the wounded ego or, thwarted ambition, and to be able to connect more to the whole and to desire to put the soul in service for the light to the planet.
And I love your reference to the fact that the archetypes are not personal. It kind of wipes this slate clean. And then from that, I think I can make choices as to how do I want to respond to those influences.
Absolutely. Because when we're kind of in that sense of, again, being like sometimes unconsciously hijacked by a pattern, Do you know? And I think interestingly, like when we look at, say, myths as well, there's so many people in this field of work that, you know, are also, you know, have, you know, that ugly duckling myth alive in them. And so when sometimes, you know, we see them maybe as the swan, but if they in their inner mind, the inner picture is still the ugly duckling, that's their relationship of the world, not being able to find their place. And so I think part of it is, again, being able to kind of recognize, like Carl Jung would say, the most important thing to recognize is what myth am I living? And that's why a lot of the work that I now do is around the myth of Persephone and Hades, because it's so important to recognize the death and the rebirth cycle within ourselves. And, you know, we can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. It's this narrative that doesn't work anymore of like continuous upward linear kind of growth. And I think we know in our own personal lives, it's not that either. So it's, again, the ability to engage the mystery. And I think that's, again, archetypes have this beautiful mystery with them. Instead of using them to fix or to solve, it's actually, how do I, you know, go into the darkness hand in hand with them, knowing that the archetypal world will always be there to bestow some light and some grace, to also develop that depth within ourselves, because really, what person do you know of courage and compassion that actually hasn't got there through trauma? And so again, compassion really comes from the word encompass, to be able to hold everything. And I think that's really what the archetypal world and the mythic world gives us, is to be able to have an access to the wealth of almost like the human storehouse of wisdom, of what it means to be alive.
It amazes me how you can weave in the story and the mythology. Did you grow up on that, or did you study that, or how did that whole world, especially around mythology, come to be of interest to you?
Yes, I didn't grow up with it. So, and I think it's one of those things that you do meet people that, you know, they're like the folk stories and the folk tales and everything was really, really part of their childhood. It wasn't that way for me. But probably, like most people, was introduced to Joseph Campbell through Bill Moyers. And there was just such truth that spoke to me of what Campbell was saying. And I don't just mean in that follow your bliss. There's so much of his work that, for me, is, again, to the core of the human and the spiritual experience. And so through that, then I found, almost in a way, the myths were, because the left brain and the right brain work differently. And the right brain, it interprets and perceives through symbols, through mythology, through archetypes. The closest it really gets to language is poetry. And I know whenever I've struggled with anything in my life, the left brain cognitive 5-step kind of self-help model just never worked for me, you know. But watching a Netflix series around some archetypal transformation or a mythical figure, it somehow was like this balm to my heart that I couldn't get through, again, that more linear or scientific or medically proven kind of way, by going into the right brain, into the ritual, by going into the embodiment, by going into the storytelling. Again, it healed me in no other way. And so I think stories can destroy us just as much as they can transform us. And so it's so important, the stories, as I said, that we tell to ourselves about ourselves, but the stories that we share and pass on, and almost in a sense, the ones that really point us to the truth of who we can be when we rise to the occasion of what wisdom, or in a more Platonic sense, of what truth and beauty and love is asking of us.
And speaking of truth and beauty and love, can you speak to how any of those influences are expressed maybe through your own creativity, or the relationship of creativity and archetype?
Yeah, I mean, I would say truth in the sense, like, it's so it's true at the moment for me that it's like 3:29 p.m. in Lithuania, just as much as it's true for you 7 hours earlier on the East Coast. So, but they're almost, in a way, they're little t truths. They're not capital T truths. And I think that through working with clients, it's really being able to get to what are some of those capital T universal truths that exist. I think also in the sense of that justice, it's very much in the advocate and the avenger archetype, and just the sense of giving a voice to the voiceless, but the injustices that occur. And I think really that that post-esteem anger that we can sometimes get about someone that did us wrong a couple of years ago, but we didn't have the self-esteem then to do something about it, just as much as being able to give a voice to the planet. And then I think also in the sense in that beauty, it's again that inner light, that inner radiance. And I think sometimes you can be around some people where their self-acceptance just can kind of cloak you in a blanket. Sometimes it's something that you can't even give to yourself. And that's just such a to be around people like that, that's beautiful. But the sense that the beauty is something that is almost in a way cosmic, in a sense, where we feel a person's energy or their vibrance or their grace. And there we go. There's some graceful moments there with modern day kind of life turning everything off there. But it's that when we're around someone's presence, and it's just, to me, that is the thing that I think really speaks to me about when we can then say, and what archetypes are in a way coordinating the communication of that grace. Is it that the person has a mystic and within them, and that's why the way that they listen, it's almost like 5 or 6 levels deeper than the ordinary coffee shop kind of conversation that you kind of have? Or is it the artist that's really pointing you to be able to go beyond the 5 senses to have a more symbolic insight into life? Or the way that a gardener that they don't use like militaristic language, like I smashed it or I killed it. It's all about the nurturing or kind of the pruning of something. So I think that again, we can then see the archetypal makeup of a person. And almost sometimes it's like we wish that some of that grace would also be bestowed onto us. Yeah.
At the risk of sounding kind of coffee shopish, do you have a favorite archetype?
Whoa. I know the one that the most that myself that I need to work with consistently in my life is the mystic, in the sense of it's almost, or I'd even say when someone is having issues or a problem or something like that, get your shaman's mind out, again. And I think that's where these archetypes work, because sometimes in ourselves, or for those of you that are familiar with, the work that was around the warrior and the lover and the magician and the sovereign, it's like, what would the warrior do in this position, or the lover? And sometimes it's like, well, if I had a shaman's mind, how would I kind of perceive this kind of situation? So I think that, again, and the mystic really allows me to have much more that eternal perspective when I'm very caught up in the temporal. And I think the other ones that to me that really, I guess, always speak to me is almost again, a bit like either the shapeshifter or the dreamer or the wise woman, where moving through different kind of levels of consciousness. And again, for many people that do this work, I always say the visionary and the orphan child are interlinked, because with the visionary you can see a world that doesn't exist yet, but you might not be able to articulate it or get the funds to be able to manifest it or have a team to help you co-create it. And you'll often go into that orphan child, nobody gets me, nobody understands me, I'm all alone, and the pain of that. And I think that there's, for me, always just remembering that mystic's archetype, where it's like, maybe sometimes we might feel rejected by society or we don't fit in, but it's usually the rebels and the outsiders that actually have the medicine, because they have the capacity to stand on the fringes and the margins to see what the masses require. So I think there's just certain patterns that I can kind of go back to that I know that can hold me at a deeper level when sometimes some of those like left brain insecurities start attacking me.
So I know you mentioned Hades and Persephone. Is that your current work, or what are you working on currently?
Yeah, that is my current work, which is a reimagining of the Persephone and Hades myth in modern times. What does that look like? Partly, I think it's so crucial that this is the myth of our time because it's obviously irrelevant in regards to the environment and to nature. But also, to me, it's also symbolic of what we've all been through in the world through this pandemic, which is a collective dark night. And so those of us in a way that have been through our individual dark night, how do we then in a way now be another archetype, a guide, or like Persephone was a guide to the underworld for the collective dark night that we are now in and going through. And again, just the sense that how important it is to be able to live seasonally, the metaphorical seasons of life, just as much as the natural seasons, and how we've almost lost that cyclical and holographic viewpoint on life. And so that's why that myth is very dear to my heart, and people can view my TEDx, which was based on that myth.
And will that also be another book?
Yes, it will be. I can't say again exactly when the release date will be, but the book is the manuscript's being shopped around at the moment, so it'll be up.
Just so exciting. Wow. Will that be kind of allegorical as Grace in the Wind is, or?
Because I feel that that's actually how we learn. We don't learn in, as I said, those like 5 easy steps or spiritual bypassing books. It's really when we can identify with a character. Even if you think of, for me, it was really, in the Queen's Gambit, the lead character, when you can identify with her so completely that actually her catharsis or her transformation, or characters or whoever the protagonist is that you've identified, if you really identify with them, and if the writers have done a really good job with their archetypal patterns so they feel like a whole human being to you, their transformation also belongs to you. It is also conferred to you. And so that's why I feel also like the best futurists actually really are filmmakers, because they give us visions to live into. We've always then, our body in a way somatically can sense what the future is bringing, because really we do have to move out of this Cartesian thinking of I think, therefore I am, to much more it's I sense, therefore I am. And I think for those of us that work in the archetypal world, we recognize the future is not thought into being, it's sensed, but also that intuition is really our first sense, not our sixth sense.
Wow, just beautifully stated. I love that thought. And I know that time is precious, and I want to just bring our time together to a close, and all of your information will be accessible for the TED Talk and the your website and that sort of thing. But on a final note, is there something that you want the world to know?
Wow. I would say, and it's a very, maybe it can be a leap if you're new to this world, that the archetypal world and the mythic world is more powerful than the physical world.
Oof, wow.
And so don't look for power in the wrong places. And I don't mean power in the sense of a patriarchal or a power over sense. I mean in the way that you direct your life force. Because that's really all a spiritual crisis is, or a crisis in your life is the mismanagement of your life force. But in that sense of power, again, it belongs in the archetypal world. And then when you can actually start seeing how that flow of power works through the psyche, and then what you can actually do with that to then obviously, of course, bring it into the physical world. But it first starts in the invisible before it's made visible, in the unmanifest before it's manifest, in the unseen before it's seen. So it's really training our eyes to go beyond what is, I guess, in a way, definitively seen, that we can see and touch and taste and through the senses, but that deeper knowing. And I think that to be able to rest in that deeper knowing is great comfort, as I said, as we all go through this collective dark night.
Well, I knew this was going to be a deep conversation, but it certainly feels very profound as well. And Kristina, thank you so much for sharing yourself and all the riches that you bring with us. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my absolute pleasure being with you today, Anne. Thank you.